The crystal chandeliers of Nexus Prime's grand ballroom cast prismatic rainbows across the assembled delegates, each beam of light catching on jeweled scales, polished carapaces, and flowing robes that cost more than most planetary defense budgets. I, Keth Valos, had attended precisely 47 of these diplomatic receptions in my career as a Zeridian cultural attaché, and they had all followed the same predictable pattern: posturing, politics, and enough pretentious conversation to power a small star. Tonight promised to be different, though I had no idea just how dramatically different it would become. The air hummed with the soft chatter of a dozen languages, each species clustering around their own kind while maintaining the careful distances dictated by centuries of interstellar protocol. Near the viewing ports, the Alteron delegation discussed trade routes in their melodious tones, their silver skin shimmering with each emotion. The Crystallian ambassadors had formed a perfect geometric circle around the dessert display, their transparent forms refracting the light into dancing patterns on the floor. But it was the group near the central fountain that drew my attention and my growing irritation. Trade Prince Nexgor Vane dominated the conversation both physically and vocally, his 8-foot frame encased in the kind of bio-armor that announced wealth and power to anyone within sight. The purple-tinted plates shifted and gleamed as he gestured expansively, holding court among his usual collection of sycophants and social climbers. "Did you know," Corvain was saying, his voice carrying farther than necessary, "that humans still practice something called dating? Apparently, they engage in elaborate courtship rituals that can last for months before deciding whether to mate. How wonderfully primitive." The laughter that followed made my secondary stomach clench with discomfort. Ambassador Trix Melanor, whose pale blue features held the perpetual expression of someone who had tasted something sour, leaned closer to the group. "I heard they actually experience something called heartbreak," she added with theatrical amazement. "When their mating bonds dissolve, they suffer actual physical pain. Imagine being so emotionally underdeveloped that feelings could manifest as bodily harm." More tittering followed, and I found myself gripping my glass harder than necessary. Yes, humans were newcomers to galactic society. Yes, they came from what most species considered an unusually harsh homeworld. But the casual cruelty of these conversations always left me feeling vaguely sick. "Of course," continued Prince Corvain, warming to his favorite topic, "what else would you expect from a species that evolved competing with predators? They probably think aggression is romantic. I would not be surprised if their courtship involved actual combat." The crowd around him erupted in delighted laughter, several beings making exaggerated fighting motions with their various appendages. The whole display was embarrassing, but unfortunately typical of how Earth's newest alliance partners were discussed in private. That was when the great doors at the hall's entrance chimed their arrival announcement. Now arriving, cultural liaison, Zara Blackwood, representing the Terran Federation. The conversations didn't stop immediately, but they did grow quieter as heads turned toward the entrance with curiosity. After an evening of discussing humans like exotic specimens, everyone was eager to see what their actual representative would look like. I turned with the rest of them, expecting to witness either a confirmation of their prejudices or perhaps an uncomfortable confrontation between expectation and reality. What I saw instead was something that made my cognitive processors skip entirely. Zara Blackwood stood in the doorway like she had been placed there by an artist who specialized in impossible beauty. She was perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with auburn hair that caught the light like spun copper wire. Her dress was simple, a deep emerald fabric that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated, and she wore it with a kind of natural confidence that couldn't be bought or taught. But it was her smile that stopped conversations mid-sentence across the entire ballroom, not the practiced diplomatic expression I had expected. but something genuine and warm, as if she were genuinely delighted to be there, despite everything she must have known about how these events typically went for her species, that the silence stretched for several heartbeats before the whispered commentary began. "That's a human?" someone muttered behind me. "She seemed so ... small," added another voice. "Are we certain this isn't their offspring? Perhaps the real diplomat is arriving separately?" Zara seemed completely oblivious to the stares and speculation. She approached the nearest group of delegates with the kind of graceful confidence that spoke of someone entirely comfortable in her own skin, regardless of the environment. "Ambassador Melanor," she said, extending her hand in the traditional human greeting while pronouncing the Alteron's name with perfect accent and inflection. "What an honor to finally meet in person. I've been following your work on interspecies labor agreements, and I found your recent paper on wage standardization absolutely brilliant." Trix Melanor looked like someone had just asked her to solve a complex equation while standing on her head. She reluctantly accepted the handshake, her pale features cycling through several shades of confusion. "Yes, well," she stammered, clearly unprepared for genuine professional courtesy from someone she had been mentally categorizing as a primitive savage just moments before. "Thank you, I suppose." I had to admit I was impressed. Zara was either completely naive about the undercurrents of prejudice swirling around her, or she possessed nerves made from pure neum. She moved through the ballroom like she belonged there, engaging each group in intelligent conversation about their areas of expertise, asking thoughtful questions about cultural exchange programs and economic partnerships. But I could see the reactions. Some delegates watched her with a wary fascination, usually reserved for dangerous predators who might suddenly reveal their true nature. Others stared with barely concealed amusement, as if her very presence was some kind of elaborate joke they were waiting to reach its punchline. As the evening progressed and the synthetic alcohol lowered inhibitions, the comments grew bolder and more openly mocking. I heard humans still make life partnership decisions based on something called love, Trade Counselor Vex Palin announced loudly enough for half the room to hear. Imagine choosing a mate based on emotional attachment rather than genetic compatibility. And resource allocation. How wonderfully irrational. A wave of condescending laughter followed his observation. Zara, who had been discussing atmospheric processing techniques with a group of terraforming specialists, glanced over briefly, but continued her conversation without missing a beat. "Well, what else would you expect from a species that considers monogamy to be romantic rather than economically inefficient?" Added cultural attach well gratin. They actually believe in something called soulmates, the idea that the universe creates perfect partners for each individual. The laughter grew louder, and I noticed several beings discreetly activating their personal recording devices, clearly hoping to capture something embarrassing they could share later across their social networks. Zara finished her conversation and moved toward the refreshment station, still maintaining that same warm, professional demeanor. But I was beginning to notice subtle changes in her body language. The smile remained genuine, but her movements had taken on a kind of fluid precision that hadn't been there before. I wonder if she even comprehends the sophistication of our discussions, mused Minister Glexthornon, making no effort to lower his voice. I've heard human cognitive development plateaus quite early compared to truly evolved species. Oh, I'm certain she understands every word, replied Ambassador Keelix-Strond with a particularly unpleasant chuckle. The question is whether she has sufficient emotional regulation to avoid reverting to her species' primitive behavioral patterns. That comment drew the biggest laugh yet, with several delegates actually applauding the wit. I found myself feeling increasingly uncomfortable, not just with their casual cruelty, but with something else I couldn't quite identify. Because while everyone else was watching Zara like she was entertainment, I was watching her watch them. And what I saw in her expression wasn't embarrassment or anger or confusion. It was calculation. The way her eyes tracked each speaker, cataloging every insult. The way she positioned herself to maintain visual contact with the largest groups while keeping escape routes clear. The way her smile never wavered, even as her stance subtly shifted into something that looked less like diplomatic posture and more like ... well, more like someone who is very good at waiting for exactly the right moment. That realization sent an uncomfortable chill down my spine, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. 2 hours into this diplomatic disaster, Prince Gorvain finally decided that subtle mockery wasn't sufficient for his entertainment needs. He positioned himself and his entourage near the refreshment station like a spider waiting for prey, and when Zara approached to refill her glass, they moved to surround her. "Well, well," Gorvain boomed, his voice echoing across the suddenly quieter ballroom. "If it isn't our charming primitive guest. Tell me, human, is it true that your species still believes in something called romance? I've heard the most fascinating stories about Deathworld mating displays." The laughter that followed had an ugly edge to it. Zara's smile remained perfectly in place, but I noticed her grip shift slightly on her crystal glass. "I think you might have us confused with some entertainment programs, Your Excellence," she replied with gentle humor. "Human relationships are actually quite sophisticated." "Sophisticated?" sneered one of his cronies, a thin Veltharian named Rex Malcor. "Everyone knows Deathworlders can't separate emotional responses from logical decision-making. It must be a genetic limitation." "Speaking of limitations," added another lackey, "is it true that humans actually cry when their partnerships end? Such a bizarre physiological response to social restructuring." I could see other diplomats gravitating toward the spectacle, drawn by the promise of entertainment at someone else's expense. Recording devices emerged from formal robes and diplomatic pouches, like flowers blooming in a particularly toxic garden. "I heard they compose poetry for their mates," Prince Gorvain continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Imagine being so intellectually limited that you express affection through primitive verbal arrangements instead of proper genetic analysis and resource agreements." Zara set down her glass with deliberate care and turned to face him directly, that warm smile still perfectly in place. "Your Excellence, I think there might be some cultural misunderstandings here. Perhaps we could discuss this more privately." "Privately?" Gorvain's laughter sounded like grinding gears. "Oh no, little primitive. I think this conversation is quite educational for everyone present. After all, we should all understand what we're dealing with when it comes to your species." The crowd was growing larger now, sensing something significant about to happen. I wanted desperately to intervene, but diplomatic protocol demanded neutrality. And what could one minor attach do against a trade prince and his political network? "Tell me," Gorvain said, leaning down until his armored face was uncomfortably close to hers. "When you return to your little Deathworld, do you report to your tribal leaders about how civilized species view your people? Do you compose sad poetry about not being accepted?" The casual cruelty in his voice made something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't diplomacy or even politics. This was simply bullying, dressed up in formal robes and justified by prejudice. And that was when I realized that Zara Blackwood had stopped smiling. "Excuse me, Your Excellence," she said, her voice still perfectly polite despite the growing hostility. "I believe I should return to my other conversations now." She moved to step around the circle of Veltharians, but Gorvain shifted to block her path. His massive frame cast a shadow over her smaller form, and the message was unmistakable. "You don't leave until I'm finished with you." "Oh, I don't think so," he said, his voice dropping to something that might have been threatening if directed at someone who could be intimidated. "We haven't finished our cultural exchange yet." You see, I find it absolutely fascinating how your species tries to mimic civilization. Zara tried to move in a different direction, but his supporters smoothly closed ranks, effectively trapping her in the center of their circle. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. "Please," she said, and for the first time all evening, I heard something other than diplomatic politeness in her voice. Something that made every instinct the first possessed whisper warnings about predators and prey and the thin lines between them. I would really prefer to avoid any unpleasantness. That was when Trade Prince Nexcor Vane of the Veltharian Consortium made the most expensive mistake of his very privileged life. Instead of recognizing the warning in her voice, instead of stepping back and allowing her the graceful exit she had requested, he threw back his head and laughed a sound like breaking glass and grinding metal. "Unpleasantness?" he roared. "From a pathetic death world romantic like you?" And then, in front of 300 of the galaxy's most important dignitaries, with recording devices capturing every moment for posterity, he reached out with one armored hand and deliberately knocked her glass from her fingers, sending emerald liquid splashing across her dress. The crystal shattered against the marble floor with a sound like gunshots. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Prince Gorvain stood there with satisfied smugness painted across his features, clearly expecting tears, anger, or some kind of primitive outburst that would validate every stereotype he had voiced about human emotional instability. He received none of those things. Instead, Zara Blackwood did something that made every nerve ending in my body scream danger warnings I couldn't rationally explain. She looked down at the stains spreading across her dress, then up at the broken crystals scattered around her feet. She knelt gracefully and picked up the largest shard, holding it up to catch the light like she was examining a precious gemstone. Then she looked at Prince Gorvain and smiled. But this wasn't the warm, diplomatic expression she had worn all evening. This was something entirely different, something cold and calculating and absolutely terrifying in its complete absence of fear or anger. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the dead silence. "I was wondering when someone would finally show me who they really are." The prince's purple complexion began shifting toward blue as the implications of her calm response registered. Around us, I could hear delegates beginning to whisper frantically, and more than one ambassador was discreetly moving toward the exits. Zara rose smoothly to her feet, still holding the crystal shard, still wearing that smile that made my scales itch with nervous anticipation. "You've just made a very interesting choice, Your Excellence," she continued, her voice never rising above conversational volume. "I hope you're prepared to discover what choice I make in return." The tension in the ballroom was thick enough to cut with a plasma blade when the entrance chimes sounded again. Every head turned, some hoping for a distraction from the increasingly uncomfortable scene, others annoyed at having their entertainment interrupted. Now arriving, Security Specialist Dante Roswell, Terran Federation. The man who stepped through the doors made even Prince Gorvain's impressive stature seem less intimidating. Dante Roswell stood just over 6 feet tall, with dark hair and the kind of lean, efficient build that suggested someone who had spent years turning his body into a precision instrument. He wore a simple black suit that somehow managed to look both formal and practical, and his dark eyes swept the room with the systematic attention of someone trained to assess threats. But what struck me most was how those eyes found Zara immediately, taking in her stained dress, the broken crystal at her feet, and the circle of Veltharian nobles surrounding her in the span of a single heartbeat dot. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. The polite professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath before snapping back into place. My apologies for the late arrival, Dante said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, as he began walking toward the group. I trust I haven't missed anything important? Prince Gorvain straightened to his full height, clearly annoyed at having his moment interrupted. Nothing that concerns you, human. We were simply having a cultural discussion with your colleague. Cultural discussion, Dante repeated, his tone perfectly neutral as he took in the scene. His gaze lingered on the broken glass, the wine stain on Zara's dress, and the way the Veltharians had positioned themselves to prevent her movement. How educational. He stepped smoothly into the circle, and I noticed how his positioning instantly changed the dynamic. Suddenly, Zara wasn't trapped. She was flanked. The psychological impact was immediate and obvious. Zara, Dante said, offering her a slight bow that managed to be both respectful and protective. I apologize for being delayed. I hope these gentlemen have been treating our diplomatic mission with the courtesy it deserves. The emphasis he placed on the word gentleman was so subtle it was almost inaudible, but the insult landed with surgical precision. Several of the Veltharians bristled visibly. Your colleague was just explaining human mating rituals to us, Prince Gorvain said, his voice taking on an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. Fascinating stuff, really. All that primitive emotion and irrational bonding. Dante's smile was pleasant and completely terrifying. Ah, romance. Yes, humans do tend to approach relationships differently than some species. We believe love should be a choice made freely by equals, not an arrangement of convenience or power. The subtle dig at Veltharian marriage contracts, which were notoriously mercenary affairs, brought a dangerous glint to Gorvain's eyes. How wonderfully naive, the trade prince sneered. But then again, what else would we expect from a species that hasn't learned to separate emotion from logic? Tell me, do you also believe in soulmates and other such fantasy concepts? I believe, Dante replied with the same pleasant smile, that the capacity for deep emotional connection is a sign of evolutionary sophistication, not primitive thinking. After all, it takes considerable cognitive development to form bonds based on choice, rather than mere biological imperatives. The insult was beautifully crafted, subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, while cutting deep enough to draw blood. Around us, I could see other delegates beginning to realize they were witnessing something far more complex than simple cultural mockery. Gorvain's bio-armor shifted to a darker purple, a clear sign of agitation among his species. Cognitive development? From the species that still fights wars over emotional attachments? Please. Actually, Zara interjected smoothly, speaking for the first time since Dante's arrival. Human conflicts tend to be about resources, territory, and ideology much, like every other species. Though I suppose it's easier to dismiss what you don't understand as primitive emotion. The double-team response was so perfectly coordinated, it had to be either rehearsed or instinctual. Either way, it was devastatingly effective. You dare, Gorvain began, his voice rising dangerously. I dare to correct a factual error, Zara continued with serene calm. Though if you prefer comfortable misconceptions to accurate information, I understand completely. Some minds aren't built for challenging new concepts. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. What had started as casual bullying was rapidly evolving into something much more serious. Captain Jex Thorne, the station's head of security, appeared at my shoulder with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he had been monitoring the situation from the beginning. Perhaps, he murmured in my ear, we should prepare for complications. Before I could respond, Prince Gorvain took a step closer to Zara, using his size advantage in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. Listen carefully, little savage, he said, his voice low and menacing. You may have convinced some, weak-minded species that humans deserve a seat at the civilized table. But I know what you really are. Violent, irrational, inferior. The silence stretched taut as a suspension cable. Every being in the ballroom was watching now. Recording devices openly displayed, conversations completely forgotten. Dante moved not aggressively, but with fluid precision that placed him directly between Gorvain and Zara. The motion was so smooth, it was almost dance-like, but the message was unmistakable. "Your Excellence," he said, his voice still perfectly polite, "I think you may be operating under some unfortunate misconceptions about my species. Perhaps we could arrange a more formal educational opportunity?" The phrase formal educational opportunity hung in the air like an unexploded weapon. In galactic diplomatic circles, it was a euphemism everyone recognized, but rarely heard spoken aloud. Prince Gorvain's eyes widened as the implications registered. "Are you challenging me, human?" "I'm offering to correct your misconceptions through whatever method you find most convincing," Dante replied with that same pleasant, terrifying smile. "After all, learning should be engaging, don't you think?" The crowd began backing away now, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be far more dramatic than simple social embarrassment. Captain Thorne stepped forward, his own diplomatic training warring with his security responsibilities. "Gentlemen, perhaps we could—" "No," Prince Gorvain interrupted, his bio-armor now cycling through shades of deep purple and red that indicated barely controlled rage. "No, I think this is perfect. A chance to demonstrate to the entire galactic community exactly what humans are capable of when their primitive emotions override their limited reasoning." He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "I, Trade Prince Nex Gorvain of the Veltharian Consortium, formally invoke the right of educational correction against these human representatives. Let the record show that I am willing to demonstrate the superiority of evolved civilized thinking over Deathworld savagery." The announcement sent a ripple of shock through the assembled delegates. The right of educational correction was an ancient protocol, rarely invoked and even more rarely witnessed. It allowed disputes between species to be settled through formal challenge, with the understanding that the victor's cultural perspective would be considered validated by the outcome. Captain Thorne looked like he wanted to object, but diplomatic immunity and ancient law tied his hands completely. Dante exchanged a glance with Zara, a communication so brief and subtle that most beings would have missed it entirely. But I caught it, and what I saw there made my secondary heart skip a beat. They weren't surprised by this turn of events. If anything, they looked satisfied. "We accept," Zara said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the now completely silent ballroom. "Under traditional Veltharian law, which allows the challenged party to choose the specific nature of the contest." Gorvain's smugness faltered slightly. Ancient law was apparently something he hadn't considered when making his dramatic gesture. "And," Dante added with that same pleasant smile, "since this involves both of us, we invoke the right of bounded challenge, which allows partnership teams to face individual opponents under traditional combat protocols." Now the prince was looking distinctly uncomfortable. Bonded challenge was an even more ancient law, dating back to the early days of interspecies contact. It was designed to account for species that formed strong pair bonds, allowing them to face challenges as unified teams rather than individuals. "You can't be serious," Gorvain sputtered. "Bonded challenge requires actual emotional bonding, not just professional partnership." Dante and Zara looked at each other again, and this time the communication between them was longer, deeper, filled with something that made the air around them seem to shimmer with potential energy. "That," Zara said softly, never taking her eyes off Dante's face, "won't be a problem." The way she said it, the way they looked at each other, the way the space between them seemed to crackle with invisible electricity, suddenly everyone in the ballroom understood that whatever was happening here involved far more than diplomatic protocol or species prejudice. The challenge will take place in the station's formal arena tomorrow at the 13th hour, Captain Thorne announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence with professional efficiency. Traditional Veltharian rules will apply, with concessions made for the bonded challenge protocols. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excited conversation about the unprecedented turn of events, I found myself watching the two humans with growing fascination. They stood close together now, speaking in voices too low for even my enhanced hearing to catch. But their body language told a story that needed no translation. The way Dante's hand rested lightly on Zara's shoulder. The way she leaned almost imperceptibly into his presence. The way they seemed to exist in a bubble of shared understanding despite the chaos swirling around them. "Keth," Captain Thorne said quietly, appearing beside me again. "What exactly do you think we just witnessed?" I watched Dante brush a piece of broken crystal from Zara's dress, with movements so gentle they seemed almost reverent. Watched her smile up at him with an expression that transformed her entire face into something radiant and fierce and absolutely beautiful. "I think," I said slowly, "we just watched two humans fall in love while simultaneously agreeing to prove their species' worth to the entire galactic community. That seems ... complicated." "Captain," I replied, unable to look away from the pair. "I have a feeling complicated doesn't even begin to cover what we're going to see tomorrow." The formal arena aboard Nexus Prime had been designed to accommodate challenges from dozens of species, its adaptive architecture shifting to match whatever protocols were required. Today, it had configured itself for traditional Veltharian combat, a space that was part gladiatorial ring, part chessboard, and part psychological torture chamber. I took my seat in the observation gallery alongside nearly 1,000 other beings who had arrived to witness what many were calling the most unusual challenge in galactic diplomatic history. Word had spread fast through the station's communication networks, and representatives from species across 3 sectors had rearranged their schedules to attend. Below us, the arena floor gleamed under plasma lighting, marked with the intricate patterns that would govern today's contest. Veltharian challenge law was complex, requiring victory in 3 distinct phases: intellect, courage, and what their ancient texts called harmony of purpose, a test that had never been fully explained to outside species. Referee Quinn Nexer, a Crystallian official known for absolute fairness, stood at the center of the arena. Her transparent form caught and refracted the light into constantly shifting patterns, making her seem like a living prism. "Today's challenge," she announced, her voice resonating perfectly in the acoustically tuned space, "will follow traditional protocols adapted for bonded challenge rules. The challenging party will face tests of mind, spirit, and unified purpose." From the competitor's entrance, Prince Gorvain emerged alone, his bioarmor now polished to mirror brightness. He had spent the morning in preparation chambers, and his confidence had clearly been restored. He strutted across the arena floor like he owned it, acknowledging the cheers from his supporters with theatrical waves. "The challenging party enters with certainty of purpose," Nexer continued. "Let the challenged party now present themselves." The opposite entrance opened, and my breath caught in my throat. Zara and Dante walked out together, but their transformation was startling. Gone were the formal diplomatic clothes, replaced with simple, practical garments that looked almost ceremonial in their simplicity. Zara wore fitted pants and a sleeveless top in deep blue that brought out her eyes. Dante was dressed similarly in black, and together they moved with a synchronization that spoke of hours spent in preparation or perhaps years of knowing each other in ways that transcended conscious thought. But it was their hands that drew. Every eye in the arena. They walked fingers intertwined, and even from my distant seat, I could see the way that simple contact seemed to center both of them. There was no nervousness, no hesitation. They looked like two people who had finally stopped pretending they weren't. Meant to be together. The crowd's reaction was immediate and telling. Some delegates leaned forward with newfound interest. Others whispered frantically about the implications of what they were seeing. First test, Nexer announced, gesturing to a complex holographic display that materialized in the arena's center. Intellectual challenge. The participants must solve a multidimensional trade dispute involving 17 species, 3 conflicting, territorial claims, and resource allocation across 14 systems. Traditional time limit, 1 standard hour. Gorvain approached the display with obvious confidence, his fingers dancing across the control interface with practiced ease. Trade negotiations were his specialty, after all. He began working through the problem with methodical precision, clearly expecting to dominate this phase of the challenge. Meanwhile, Zara and Dante took a different approach entirely. Instead of diving immediately into the technical aspects, they spent precious minutes simply talking to each other. Not about the problem, about everything else. Their families. Their hopes. Stories from their childhood that had shaped how they saw the world. What are they doing? Someone whispered behind me. They're wasting time. But I was beginning to understand. The bonded challenge wasn't just about individual skill. It was about how partners complemented each other, how they created something greater than the sum of their parts. As I watched, their conversation began weaving into the problem itself. Zara's background in cultural liaison work provided insights into how each species might approach negotiations differently. Dante's security training helped him identify potential conflict points that pure economic analysis might miss. But more than that, they seemed to think together, building ideas that neither could have reached alone. With 15 minutes remaining, they finally began inputting their solution. Their movements were coordinated without being choreographed. Zara handling diplomatic frameworks, while Dante managed resource logistics, each anticipating what the other needed before it was asked for. When time expired, Nexer reviewed both solutions with careful attention. Gorvain's approach was technically competent, a standard trade optimization that would function adequately while maximizing profit for the strongest parties involved. The human solution was something else entirely. A bonded team's proposal. Nexer announced, creates sustainable prosperity for all 17 species, while establishing frameworks for future cooperation. Economic efficiency is maintained while addressing social and cultural needs that pure profit optimization ignores. Gorvain's purple complexion shifted toward red. Impossible. Resource allocation cannot account for emotional variables. Nevertheless, Nexer continued, their solution demonstrates superior long-term stability and innovative thinking. Phase 1. Bonded Team Victory. The cheers from the human supporters were drowned out by confused murmuring from delegates who had expected a very different outcome. Second test, Nexer announced as new equipment materialized. Courage trial. Each participant must face their greatest fear while maintaining focus on a complex task. This was where traditional thinking suggested humans would excel. After all, if they truly were primitive Death World savages, surely they would dominate anything involving bravery or combat. The reality was far more interesting. Gorvain's test involved piloting a ship through a holographic asteroid field while being bombarded with images and sounds designed to trigger Veltharian terror responses, primarily scenarios involving loss of status, wealth, and social position. He performed adequately, his privileged upbringing having taught him to compartmentalize discomfort in pursuit of goals. Zara and Dante faced something entirely different. Their shared challenge involved navigating a maze while experiencing Psychological pressure designed to break pair bonds illusions, showing each other in danger. False memories of betrayal, sensory inputs crafted to trigger jealousy and mistrust. What happened next left the entire arena speechless. Instead of trying to ignore or overcome the illusions, they acknowledged them directly. When Dante saw false images of Zara in danger, instead of panic, he called out calmly to tell her what he was experiencing. When Zara faced manufactured memories of him abandoning her, she spoke those fears aloud and asked for reassurance. They turned the test of courage into an exercise in vulnerability, using honesty as their weapon against deception. "I'm seeing you fall, and I can't catch you," Dante called out as they navigated a particularly complex section of the maze. "I'm here," Zara replied immediately, "right beside you. The fear is just trying to separate us." "I know," he said, and the simple faith in his voice made something in my chest ache with recognition. "I trust you more than I trust my own eyes." They completed the courage trial in record time, their communication allowing them to navigate obstacles that would have stopped individuals operating alone. Phase 2. Bonded Team Victory, Nexa announced, though her tone suggested she was as surprised as anyone else. Gorvain was visibly agitated now, his bio-armor cycling through colors that indicated severe stress. This wasn't going according to any script he had prepared for. Final test, Nexa called out. Harmony of purpose. The most sacred of Veltharian trials. The arena transformed one last time, creating a space that was part meditation chamber, part concert hall. Ancient Veltharian law required this final test to reveal the deepest truth about the participants, their fundamental nature, when all pretense was stripped away. Each party must demonstrate the core essence of their approach to existence, Nexa explained. No tools, no weapons, no technology. Only what you carry within yourself. Gorvain stepped forward with renewed confidence. This was his element, the grand gesture, the display of inherent superiority. He began a traditional Veltharian demonstration of power, his bio-armor amplifying his natural capabilities as he lifted massive objects with apparent ease and projected energy displays that filled the air with brilliant colors. It was impressive, I had to admit. Raw power, technological sophistication, and the kind of individual excellence that Veltharian culture prized above all else. When his demonstration ended, the applause was thunderous. Surely no mere humans could match such a display. Zara and Dante stepped into the center of the arena, and for a moment they simply stood there holding hands, looking at each other with expressions of such tender intimacy that it felt almost intrusive to watch. Then they began to dance. Not the formal, ritualized movements that passed for dance among most species, but something organic and flowing and completely spontaneous. They moved together like they had been partners for lifetimes, each step, each turn, each gesture flowing seamlessly into the next. But it was more than just physical coordination. As they danced, they spoke not to the audience, but to each other, sharing stories and dreams and fears with quiet voices that somehow carried to every corner of the arena. They talked about the loneliness of growing up feeling different, about the fear of never finding someone who understood them, about the moment when they first saw each other and realized they had found something they hadn't even known they were looking for. And slowly, impossibly, their simple dance began to transform the entire arena. Other beings started moving closer, drawn by something they couldn't name but couldn't resist. The harsh lighting softened. Conversations that had been interrupted. By the challenge resumed, but gentler now, more honest. Delegates who hadn't spoken to each other in years found themselves sharing memories and laughing together. "This is what humans call love," Zara said, her voice somehow reaching every ear despite its soft volume. Not the absence of logic, but a logic that includes the heart. Not primitive emotion, but the most sophisticated form of connection possible. We don't choose partners based on genetic optimization or resource allocation, Dante added, spinning her gracefully before drawing her close again. We choose them because they make us better than we could ever be alone. The dance continued, and with each step, each word, each moment of perfect harmony between them, the arena filled with something that transcended species boundaries. I found myself thinking about my own life partner back on Zeridia, remembering the moment when friendship had transformed into something deeper and more precious than mere compatibility. Around me, other beings were having similar realizations. The rigid categories of civilized and primitive, superior and inferior, were dissolving in the face of something more fundamental, the recognition that love, in all its forms, was perhaps the highest achievement any species could claim. When Zara and Dante finally came to rest in the center of the arena, still holding each other close, still looking into each other's eyes like the rest of the universe had ceased to exist, silence was profound, but not empty. It was full of understanding. Referee Nexer stepped forward, her crystalline form now glowing with soft, warm light instead of the harsh refractions she had displayed earlier. The final test reveals the deepest truth, she announced, her voice carrying new warmth. Trade. Prince Gorvain has demonstrated individual power and technological superiority, admirable qualities that serve their purpose well. She turned toward the humans, who still hadn't released each other's hands. Zara Blackwood and Dante Roswell have demonstrated that strength can multiply when shared, that vulnerability can become courage, and that two beings choosing to trust each other completely can create something more beautiful than any individual achievement. The pause stretched for several heartbeats. Under ancient law and sacred tradition, I declare the bonded challenge victorious. Furthermore, I rule that any being who chooses to mock the capacity for such connection reveals only their own limitations. The eruption of cheering from the gallery was unlike anything I had ever heard at a diplomatic function. Not polite applause or political approval, but genuine joy from beings who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Prince Gorvain stood in the center of it all, his bioarmor faded to dull gray, looking like someone who had just realized he had badly miscalculated everything. But what happened next surprised everyone, including me. Zara approached him, still, glowing with the happiness that seemed to radiate from her like starlight. "Your Excellence," she said, offering him the same warm smile she had given everyone at the reception. "Thank you for giving us the chance to show you who we really are." And then, to the amazement of everyone present, she embraced him not with mockery or triumph, but with genuine gratitude for an opponent who had pushed them to reveal their best selves. Gorvain stood frozen for a moment, his expression cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. When Zara stepped back, Dante extended his hand in the human gesture of respect between equals. "Well fought," he said simply. "Perhaps next time we can share stories instead of challenges." For the first time since I had known him, Prince Nex, Gorvain of the Veltharian Consortium, had absolutely nothing to say. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they had witnessed, I remained in my seat, watching Zara and Dante make their way slowly across the arena floor. They moved without urgency now, stopping to accept congratulations and answer questions from delegates who seemed to see them with entirely new eyes. But mostly, they simply stayed close to each other, sharing quiet conversation and small touches. That spoke of two people who had found something precious and had no intention of letting it go. Captain Thorne settled into the seat beside me, his expression thoughtful. 43 years of diplomatic service," he said quietly, "and I've never seen anything like that." "Neither have I admitted, though I suspect we'll be seeing a lot more of it. Something tells me those two are just getting started." On the arena floor below, Zara laughed at something Dante whispered in her ear, the sound carrying up to us like music. And for the first time in my long career, I found myself believing that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy was ready for something better than the careful prejudices and ancient fears we had all grown so comfortable maintaining. After all, if humans could find perfect harmony in the space of a day while facing down the combined skepticism of galactic society, what other impossible things might be possible? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. I couldn't wait to find out.